Eric, let's look ahead for the Commanders. So this team is coming off a great season, knocking off the Lions in the playoffs. Now, to me, anyways, they look like one of the more improved teams in the offseason. Where do you see them in the NFC this year?
Yeah, so last season, I mean, I am a Commanders fan. You see the hat, so there is always going to be a little bit of bias, but I did think they were going to be a playoff team last year and sneak in. We see a lot of teams in the NFL year over year who go through some turnaround, have that little bit of an easier schedule, then, propel from worst to first in division or into the playoffs. It is a common theme in the National Football League. And we saw Washington be that team. And then I feel like the season after, everybody has to be a little bit skeptical and think, okay, was this a 1 year wonder where they took advantage of some variance, a good schedule, and made some plays? Or is this team actually building toward the future? And when you have Jayden as a quarterback, I think it's absolutely you can't really frame it any other way than they are building toward the future. Jayden is already in the conversation of the top 5 or 6 best quarterbacks in the NFL. They have a continuity now with Cliff Kingsbury and, of course, adding Debo and Laramie to fill up 2 very big voids on the offensive side of the football. And this defense, I mean, obviously it played very poorly last year, though it came on toward the end of the season. From a pure personnel perspective, it was a very poor unit. So they were punching above their weight class. And now the team has taken some strides to, shore up some things like with safety Will Harris, cornerback Jonathan Jones, and of course now Marshawn Lattimore with a full offseason in Washington within the system to learn and hopefully be that lockdown CB1. So to me, the sky's the limit for Washington. But Jayden Daniels makes winning plays. He doesn't fold under pressure. And that kind of, late game heroics that he has proven is not a fluke. One score games really break down a lot in the National Football League. And if you have that equalizer a la Jayden Daniels, Washington should certainly be in the mix for 10 plus wins this year.
I totally agree, and I love their coaching. I'm a big fan of Dan Quinn. I always have been. So I was a bit biased for this season, but has he exceeded your expectations in Washington so far?
Absolutely. And at first, when I saw the news, I was, a little bit skeptical. But that being said, after learning more about Dan Quinn, who he is as a person and the process he went through, I read an interview about how after he lost his job with Atlanta, was working in Dallas as a DC, he went to other media members, other coaches, other
Mhm.
people, and just want to understand his perception or people's perception of him around the league and where he can improve. And for an older coach, you can't really teach a lot of old dogs new tricks. But Dan Quinn came ready to learn, ready to understand, and ready to build upon his failure in Atlanta, which ended in that Super Bowl loss. And I think that the proof is in the pudding. We saw what he did
Mhm.
with Washington, the way his players rallied around him, the staff he built, the foundation he is building for the locker room and for the culture. And I could not be more impressed with Dan Quinn and what he's done. And that is coming from a Commanders fan who did have a little bit of lower expectations before knowing how keen on improving himself Quinn was before even taking this role, which has clearly materialized.
Oh, you said it. Like, if any time, any coaches that I've worked with, Dan Quinn, I just think is just one of the loveliest human beings. And I think like that stuff really does matter. And like you said, it is hard to teach old dogs new tricks, but I love hearing things like that because think for a team culture that does matter. And man, the Commanders needed a culture overhaul. We can say. Looking ahead to the draft, what position groups do they need to focus on this year? I'd love to see them bring in maybe another running back. What do they prioritize here?
I think Washington certainly drafts running back. I don't know if they do it as high as their first round pick. Washington has spent a lot of their capital, moving to get Tunsil, get Debo, made a couple of moves there. Also during the season to get Lattimore, gave up a third round pick. So Washington's draft capital has quickly become a little bit depleted. So I think trading back at their first round pick selection is definitely in the cards as Peters could
Mm,
look to recoup some talent in a deeper class for you know more premium positions that you would expect, like or even some other non-premiums, like for example, running back. It's a pretty deep class. That doesn't mean Washington has to, try to get a running back in their first round pick. I think they can definitely find one, deeper in the draft. So I think running back is absolutely on their market. They're in the market for running back, I should say. I would also suspect them to be in the market absolutely for a young edge rusher, whether
yes.
that through the draft as well. And I wouldn't be surprised to see them add maybe another wide receiver and certainly another linebacker with Bobby Wagner probably toward the end of his career, if not the last 1 or 2 seasons, if anything. And I think they're probably going to need to shore up that middle linebacking core for the future and thinking, forward looking when Wagner is gone. So I think, again, those key positional needs are offensive line always, running back, edge, and I think Washington could definitely add another receiver later in the draft as well.
Last question for you, Eric. I want to kind of just get a vibe check of Washington right now because as an outsider, this era of Commanders football feels different. And it feels like they're making a lot of moves. We don't know what'll work, what won't, but they're really going for it. And it just feels so different there. Was there a moment last season where you definitively knew, oh, this is different? Because, man, there were a lot, I don't need to tell you this, there were a lot of rough years for Washington football.
So I think the first primer was the Monday Night Football game in Cincinnati where Jayden made that throw. I think that's when we realized, like, okay, the Bengals are, which ended up obviously not making the playoffs, but the Bengals are this looked at as a championship contender. Washington went to their house and played them stride for stride. And I think my personal moment when I knew is, it's going to sound a little bit crazy, but when the Bears Commanders game was happening, I was watching a game with my sister, her boyfriend, and I was sitting there at the end of the game with the ball in Jaden's hands, and I wasn't even the slightest bit nervous. I can't say I predicted that they were going
That's
to throw
new.
that Hail Mary, but I had a feeling that this game's not over and that something could happen from this. And then, boom, the next two plays come in, and then one being that final Hail Mary. Again, not going to sit here and say I called the Hail Mary, but for the first time that I can remember watching Washington in a situation like that, and when I say when I can remember, I mean literally ever, instead of thinking, how are they going to screw it up? I was thinking, wait, we actually might be able to pull this one off.
The Dan Snyder era is so far in the rearview mirror, and it feels different. It's an exciting year, especially heading into this season. Eric Pauli, you've said it all. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and hail to the Commanders.